Let me talk a little bit about cyber war topics, and particularly Chinese cyber threats, and perhaps say a little something about the potential role of deterrence in cyberspace. In the U.S., when we think about cyber threats, we mostly do so in a fairly narrow sort of technical sense. We worry about internet-based attacks on our computer networks and about what those attacks would do to our computerized and communications-based civilian economy, military capabilities, and that sort of thing. When we talk of cyber attack, the first thing that usually comes to mind is somebody breaking into computer systems by electronic means in order to steal data. Sometimes we fret also about what someone could do with that kind of access, such as shutting down vital activities or perhaps causing the kind of mayhem that was accidentally caused in 2009 at a hydroelectric plant in Siberia, where an employee remotely was trying to run the thing by a remote portal and accidentally turned on an unused turbine, causing all sorts of weird physical interactions in the plant and causing part of it to all but explode. So that's a very technical prism through which we usually come at issues of cyber threats, and that's important. There's a lot of reason to worry about that sort of thing. We indeed face many vulnerabilities, and there certainly seems to be no shortage of would-be attackers out there. The tide of electronic probes, by the way, that washes against computer networks every day is positively breathtaking. One account that I saw in preparing for this suggested that something on the order of 21 million Trojan horse attacks were attempted in 2010 alone, a figure that was up from something like 3 million or so in 2009. But rather than get bogged in the technical detail of that sort, and I'm not a computer person, I'm a lawyer and a policy guy, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the policy and the strategic context in which all of this computer activity occurs. But to set the stage for this, I think it's worth emphasizing that not all cyber threats are created equal. The ones that seem to be giving U.S. security planners the most headaches these days are cyber infiltration efforts that have come to be known as the Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT. The term APT is used to refer to an ongoing campaign of computer attacks that was first identified in the mid-2000s, aimed mainly at networks associated with the U.S. defense industry and our armed forces. The attacks are generally traceable to China, and although inarguable proof is hard to come by in this cyber arena, they are indeed widely blamed upon the Chinese government, acting either directly, for example, through the Third Department of the People's Liberation Army, the 3PLA, or indirectly through such things as cyber privateers or so-called hacktivists, egged on or encouraged or actually sponsored by the government. According to the head of Israel's Shin Bet Security Service, China is the world's largest employer of hackers, and indeed most experts do feel that the APT is traceable, in fact, to Beijing. Now, as indicated by the acronym ADVANCED in Advanced Persistent Threat, these attacks are indeed felt to be pretty sophisticated, operating in ways much more subtle and effective than just the traditional sort of denial of service attacks that have become so lamentably common elsewhere in the computer world. In one series of campaigns against the Tibetan diaspora that was publicly revealed in 2009, for instance, intruders infected something on the order of 1,300 computers around the world, taking complete control of some of them, not only in order to search for and steal information, but in fact, in some cases, to use them covertly to spy on their owners in the physical world, such as by covertly operating or turning on webcams, for example, or audio inputs, so that your computer becomes a bug that will sort of enable the hijacker of the computer to figure out what you're doing in that room, whether or not you're actually using the computer at the time. So far, nothing has been publicly reported from the APT that matches the sophistication of the Stuxnet worm that was allegedly used by the United States and Israel against Iran's uranium enrichment facility at Natanz, nor, to my knowledge, have any reports publicly associated the APT with activities beyond covertly accessing and removing information. That is to say, more on the lines of cyber espionage than actual destructive attacks. But nevertheless, APT campaigns are believed to have netted enormous quantities of information, such as breaking into computer networks associated in the defense industry with the development of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, an attack which allegedly removed terabytes of information about that program. Moreover, this is in some sense the creepiest part, since the network access that is needed for such data exfiltration is usually just the same sort of thing that an attacker would need in order to undertake system sabotage or manipulation, it seems clear that there is an enormous potential for much more destructive mischief in this as well. Some of the most pernicious assaults that are possible in the cyber arena are likely, in my view, and that of real experts, to be those that conceal their own manipulative effects, as indeed Stuxnet tried to do, and was apparently able to do, at least for a while. or attacks that only have observable effects in the first place when remotely triggered, for example, in time of crisis. So what this means to suggest is that the APT's repeated system access over time is and should be enormously worrying, especially in conjunction with growing concern about the appearance of counterfeit Chinese-made microprocessors in the supply chain at a time when our security apparatus is ever more dependent upon commercial off-the-shelf technology. But let me return to the question of strategic context. If it is indeed true that the APT can be traced to China, we face a very potentially significant cyber adversary. But what's the game? What does China think about cyber war? As I've said elsewhere, what I understand Western experts who study such things to know about Chinese cyber doctrine suggests that officials in Beijing have a much broader concept of cyber conflict than we do. As I noted before, our conceptions of cyber war are very system-specific. We think about cyber war in terms of attacking and defending computer systems themselves. And when we imagine computer attacks having real-world effects, we envision this occurring because a computer network has been shut down or manipulated. But through Chinese eyes, and Russian as well, but that's a separate topic, I suppose, cyber war is really a much bigger phenomenon. Planners in Beijing certainly include computer system attacks in their understanding of cyber conflict, as we do. But they also include what I like to think of as more ideational attacks transmitted through the internet. Their notion of cyber war is bound up with issues of government control over information within a society, and with the manipulation of adversaries' views and decision-making processes. China fears, in other words, not just inputs of malicious code in computers, but also outside injections of ideas and perspectives that might undercut Communist Party control within China, as well as outside interventions or technologies that could facilitate political organization by the Chinese people themselves in ways that are not controllable by the regime. Through this prism, cyber conflict occurs not only in wartime, but in peacetime as well, and it encompasses all aspects of ideological, political, social, and economic competition between the Chinese government and its actual or potential adversaries at home and abroad. Now, the fact that information control, in this sort of very broad, sweeping sense, is a key objective of Chinese policy, of course, is not precisely a surprise. This is, after all, the land of the Great Firewall, the world's most ambitious effort to maintain strict government controls on internet political content. And when the head of China's state-controlled Xinhua news agency writes, as he did recently in the Wall Street Journal, that it is now time to coordinate and reset rules and order in the international media industry on the basis of theories of checking superpower and maintaining equilibrium, it's also clear that information control is a tool that Beijing imagines being used offensively as well as defensively. And these are the nuances that I think we need to bear in mind as we try to understand the relationship between Chinese strategy and the APT. The conventional wisdom about the APT is that it aims to steal defense secrets and conduct industrial espionage and intellectual property theft. And of course this it does. I would suggest, however, that it may also be that the APT fits into a broader Chinese strategic policy, a messaging strategy, if you will, that's bound up with achieving information warfare effects of just the kind that Chinese cyber doctrine would lead one to expect Beijing to wish to create. In the conventional narrative of the APT, Chinese government hackers take advantage of problems in cyberspace attack attribution in order to conceal themselves. In an arena in which cyber warriors may mount their attacks through hijacked swarms of computers belonging to innocent third parties, it is indeed devilishly hard to be sure where an attack originates. Now, this attribution problem is said, again, correctly, to complicate issues of strategic signaling and deterrence in cyberspace, giving attackers considerable leeway to do their thing without fear of the kind of retaliation that would likely result if it were clear who they really were. Even though most observers are pretty sure that China is behind it, in other words, the APT hides itself behind what in the old days used to be called plausible deniability, now in cyberspace. And indeed, the government in Beijing claims that it never, ever engages in such activity, thus preserving the pretense of selfless virtue and benevolence that Chinese rulers have claimed for themselves for thousands of years. Except it's not quite, I think, as simple as all that. Some experts who study such things are apparently surprised by the degree to which China goes to such little trouble to conceal its significant involvement in cyberspace. Officially, of course, it has no role at all, and the state-run Chinese media gleefully recount stories of Pentagon overt cyber warfare preparations as evidence of Washington's self-interested malice in world affairs. But in an environment in which it is apparently technically possible to conceal one's tracks almost entirely, It's perhaps remarkable that the campaigns of the APT are not better concealed, as having their origins at least somewhere in China. Now, perhaps seen through the broader perspective of full-spectrum information conflict, such semi-attribution is useful. It does not allow enough certainty to permit beyond a reasonable doubt attribution to the Chinese government, thus facilitating Beijing's virtuous posturings and helping prevent overt retaliation. But at the same time, the APT's tracks are not so hidden that everyone doesn't have a pretty darn good idea what's going on, and this may be quite intentional. As I suggested earlier, everyone knows that with network access, one can do more than simply steal information. He who can exfiltrate someone else's data can, of course, infiltrate his own code. And as military people will tell you, the first priority for mounting a really effective attack of any sort is good reconnaissance. So when access is coupled with a deep understanding of the target systems that is acquired through systematic reconnaissance, all sorts of things are possible. And today, it does seem clear, as one U.S. Air Force cyber general told Aviation Week a couple of months ago, that the APT is not just about espionage, but also about accessing our networks for later exploitation. In many circumstances, surely, such reconnaissance is best done covertly. One imagines, for instance, that whomever mounted the Stuxnet attack did not wish Iranian authorities to know that somebody out there was sniffing around about precisely how the control systems for Natanz and the Bushehr steam turbine worked. On the other hand, maybe in some circumstances it's useful to let people know that you're out there, and thus it may be important not entirely to conceal your tracks. As the myriad probes of the APT wash up daily against all kinds of U.S. government computer networks, maybe we are expected to see a shadowy Chinese hand behind the campaign. The message perhaps delivered to us as the most significant military power in the world, but one that is nonetheless extremely dependent upon computer and internet-facilitated connectivity. The message may be something like, "We're here. You ain't seen nothing yet, so watch your step." Now, through this prism, I would suggest the but only semi-attributable nature of the APT may serve an important purpose that complete concealment would not. On top of its considerable benefits in technology acquisition, of course, and attack preparation, the APT perhaps does double duty as a sort of strategic signaling in its own right. It's not really all that different in that sense from official Chinese leaks of information about purported stealth fighter technology that we've seen recently, from press accounts of the new DF-21 Delta anti-shipping ballistic missile, ill-concealed attack submarine deployments increasingly far afield, or the anti-satellite test in 2007, or perhaps the lasers that Chinese authorities are said to periodically shine into the sky as if to make the point that they could. Through this prism, the APT, too, may be designed in part to to encourage leaders in the U.S. and our Asian allies to believe that it's just going to be too much trouble and too dangerous for us to stand up to some future Chinese military provocation. Now, it's up to people much better informed than I am to assess whether that Chinese message is actually true. It might be, but not necessarily. And the details matter. How prepared are we, for example, for what China implicitly proclaims itself being prepared to do? What would our countermeasures be? And what parade of problems would we, on our part, be prepared to inflict upon Beijing, to confront it with having to manage if the proverbial balloon went up? These are questions I'm not going to answer here, even if I knew them. But Chinese strategic writings do seem to place enormous stock in having the clever plan, the brilliant ruse, the secret weapon or stratagem that will enable one to overcome one's enemies no matter how powerful they are. Now, when one really does have a miraculous trick up one's sleeve, that's all well and good, I suppose. But people who think that way who think that way too much can sometimes miscalculate, picking a fight that it is beyond their cleverness to win. Now, it's not for me to say what China's odds of success are in such an eventuality, but the Chinese message, at least, I think, seems clear enough. When viewing the APT, we are expected to be cowed, to be deterred from taking actions that Beijing does not wish us to take. I'll admit that it's becoming something of an annoying cliche to quote the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu on such matters, but I think it's true, in fact, to say that the best form of victory is the one that one is able to win without having to actually fight one's adversary. It's a widespread assumption in Western analyses of cyberspace that deterrence is virtually impossible in that particular arena. But I'm not entirely convinced of that, and I suspect neither are planners in Beijing.